In a valley wrapped in dense pines where sunlight only ever slipped through in fragmented shards, lived an old couple, Henry and Martha. Their small wooden cabin was a sanctuary, filled with the warmth of cedar smoke, the silent laughter of old photographs, and a love as steady and quiet as the ancient trees themselves. Their days were a gentle rhythm of shared silences and comforting routines, but as the seasons turned, the forest around them began to change. The wind, which once whispered lullabies through the branches, now seemed to murmur names on the breeze. One afternoon, as Martha sat on the porch, ripples trembled across the surface of her teacup, though no tremor shook the ground. The very air seemed to hold its breath. One dusky evening, while chopping firewood, Henry's axe struck a log with a solid thud. But then came the echo. Not just one, but two, followed by a third, strange and metallic. It was a wrong sound, an unnatural clang that made the forest feel suddenly, unnervingly alive. He paused, listening, but heard only the pounding of his own heart. That night, they put on their favorite record, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. The familiar melody filled the small cabin, a soundtrack to decades of shared memories. But as the singer crooned, the needle got stuck, repeating a single phrase over and over, "We'll stay, we'll stay, we'll stay," until the words warped into a distorted groan and dissolved into a hiss of static. Just then, the old grandfather clock in the corner chimed, then froze. Its hands pointed stubbornly to 11:59. Martha giggled, a light, tinkling sound. "Oh, Henry, the old thing's finally broken," she said, her voice a stark contrast to the sudden, profound silence that had fallen outside. It was a stillness so complete it was deafening. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sign of life at all. A strange unease settled over Henry. He opened the cabin door and stepped into the freshly fallen snow. The cold bit at his cheeks. He looked down and saw footprints, his own footprints, leading away from the porch, not in a straight line, but in a perfect circle around the cabin, as if he had been performing some unknown, repeating ritual. He hadn't left the cabin all evening. He stumbled back inside, his breath catching in his throat. Martha gasped, her eyes wide. "Henry, your beard." He touched his face. The salt and pepper stubble he'd had just minutes before was now completely white, as if decades had passed in the few moments he was outside. But inside the cabin, nothing had changed. The clock was still frozen. Time itself seemed to have fractured. From that day on, the sun no longer rose or set. Instead, the sky pulsed, shifting from a dim, perpetual twilight to a pale, weak brightness, as if the heavens themselves were taking slow, shallow breaths. And with every flicker of the light, the forest seemed to creep closer, the tree line inching toward their little home. One morning, a new tree stood by the porch, one that hadn't been there the day before. Carved into its bark, in a familiar, youthful script, were the words, "Henry plus Martha, forever here." A dark, thick sap bled from the letters like tears. That night, Martha dreamt she was young again, dancing in Henry's arms under a sky full of stars. But in the dream, the trees of the forest bent inward, their branches weaving together to form a cage of ribs around a single, beating heart. She awoke with a start, the sound of whispers filling the room, dozens of voices all calling her name. She looked at Henry, and in the reflection of his terrified eyes, she saw her own face, no longer just old, but ancient and frail. A sudden, rhythmic ticking broke the silence. It wasn't the clock, it was coming from everywhere at once, a sound like a giant, slow heartbeat. The furniture in the room began to shift and change. The worn armchair regained its plush velvet. The scuffed wooden table became smooth and new. Their wedding photograph on the mantel, once faded and yellowed, grew sharp and clear again. But as the image restored itself, their smiling faces began to vanish, fading into the background until only the empty church remained. "It's this place," Henry gasped, his voice trembling. "It's eating our years. It's taking them for itself." panic seized them. They had to get away. They threw open the door and ran, plunging into a disorienting, swirling mist that had descended upon the forest. They ran until their lungs burned, but every path they took, every desperate turn, led them right back to the front porch of their own cabin. They were trapped. The moon, which had been hidden, now loomed impossibly low and large in the sky, casting a silver, ethereal glow over the landscape. And in the shifting fog, they saw them. Thin, spindly shapes moved among the trees. They had skin like bark and deep, hollow eyes. They weren't walking, they were drifting, and as they moved, they whispered with voices that sounded eerily like Henry and Martha's own youthful laughter. One of the figures stepped forward, separating from the others. It was a young man, with Henry's face and a woodsman's axe resting on his shoulder. Behind him, another figure emerged, a young woman with Martha's bright smile, her hand extended in welcome. The real Henry and Martha, old and frail, could only scream, a raw, terrified sound that was swallowed by the mist. The forest around them shuddered, a deep guttural tremor that shook the very ground. And then, silence. When the mist finally cleared, the cabin stood as it always had. Inside, a warm fire crackled in the hearth. 2 rocking chairs sat empty beside it, gently swaying as if their occupants had just stood up. On a small table between them, 2 teacups still steamed, untouched by the passage of time. The grandfather clock ticked once more, its hands finally moving from 11:59 to midnight. And outside, in the deep, dark woods, the forest exhaled a soft, contented sigh, whispering on the wind, "Forever here." The snow fell in a thick, heavy blanket, wrapping the small cabin in a profound silence. It was a stillness so complete it felt almost sacred, like the world was holding its breath. Henry stirred from sleep, the first light of a gray dawn filtering through the window. He found Martha already there, her back to him, humming a tune he couldn't quite place. Her finger traced delicate patterns on the fogged-up glass. "They're watching again," she whispered, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. Her reflection in the pane seemed to flicker, a ghostly second face superimposed over the snowy landscape. As if on cue, the old battery-powered radio on the shelf crackled to life, completely on its own. A faint, tinny lullaby drifted into the room, a melody neither of them had ever heard before. It was the first sign that the house was waking up too. Soon, the floorboards began to sigh under an invisible weight. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint rhythmic beat, like the slow thrum of a giant heart. Henry's eyes were drawn to the old, faded portrait hanging over the mantel. It had always been a simple wedding photo, but now it was different. Their younger selves were still there, but they were standing in the forest, their smiles stretched into something unsettling, almost eerie. A cold dread began to seep into Henry's bones. He needed to see. Grabbing his heavy lantern, he pushed open the cabin door and stepped into the biting cold. The world outside was distorted. Every tree seemed to have moved closer, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. As the lantern light danced across the bark, he could almost make out faces etched into the wood, their features shifting in the flickering glow. He saw a trail of footprints in the fresh snow and followed them, only to find they led in a perfect circle, ending right back where he stood. As he straightened up, a whisper brushed against his ear, so close it felt like it was inside his own head. It was his own voice, clear as day, saying, "You never left." He rushed back inside, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The cabin felt even colder than the outdoors. Martha was standing by the small kitchen table, staring at a teacup. "It's still warm," she said, her voice trembling. "I haven't touched it in hours." She called out for Henry, her voice echoing in the unnerving silence. But the only reply was the house itself, mimicking her call, her name bouncing from wall to wall, growing fainter and fainter until it was just a whisper. From that moment on, reality began to fray at the edges, unraveling scene by scene. Objects would rearrange themselves when their backs were turned. The grandfather clock in the corner began to melt into its own reflection in the polished floor. Shadows danced wildly in the corners of the room, even when there was no light source to cast them. The strangeness was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical presence, twisting their home into a nightmare. Martha rushed to the window, searching for any sign of normalcy, of Henry. She saw him then, a dark figure standing at the edge of the tree line, his back to her. He seemed to be in conversation, his head nodding, his hands gesturing to someone, or something, she couldn't see. Fear gave her strength and she ran out to him, her boots sinking into the deep snow. "Henry!" she cried. When she finally reached him and he turned around, she gasped. His eyes were no longer the warm brown she knew. They were hollow voids, filled with a swirling cosmos of distant stars. "We promised forever," he said. But his voice was wrong. It was his, yet it was layered with another, a deeper, ancient rumble that seemed to vibrate from the very ground beneath their feet. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sound of whispers, their own wedding vows, repeated over and over like an endless, binding curse. Together, they turned to look back at their home. But the cabin was different. It looked newer, the wood brighter, the roof perfectly intact, as if it had been rebuilt for a wedding that had never truly ended. A soft, warm light glowed from the windows. Hesitantly, they walked back and stepped inside. The air was filled with the scent of beeswax. Dozens of candles burned brightly on every surface, casting a gentle, romantic light, though they hadn't lit a single one in years. On the dining table, nestled on a velvet cloth that hadn't been there before, lay their wedding rings. They weren't the worn, familiar bands they wore every day. These were brand new, gleaming and perfect, just as they had been on their wedding day. Martha, in a daze, reached for hers, but her hand felt no resistance. It passed right through the ring, through the table itself, like she was nothing more than smoke. That's when time completely shattered. The past and present folded in on themselves. Their younger selves materialized, dancing across the floor in a joyous waltz, their laughter echoing and mingling with the sound of Martha's quiet sobs. The old phonograph in the corner, which had been silent for a decade, began to spin backward, its needle whispering a chilling, looping phrase in a distorted, childlike voice. "Forever here. Forever here. Forever here." The forest was no longer just outside. It was pressing against the windows, the glass groaning under the pressure. In the darkness between the trees, countless eyes began to blink open, watching them. Henry pulled Martha into his arms, his body trembling uncontrollably against hers. "If we stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it stops. Maybe this is what it wants." Henry could only nod, tears tracing frozen lines down his face as he held her tighter. They sat down together on the floor as the snow, impossible and white, began to pour in through cracks in the walls that hadn't been there moments before. The candle flames flickered and died one by one. The warm glow of the fire in the hearth faded to embers, then to black. The last thing to be seen in the encroaching darkness was their two silhouettes, slowly growing still, their forms hardening, their outlines merging with the wooden walls until they were no longer two people, but simply a part of the cabin itself. Outside, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the sun rose. Morning came. The cabin stood silent and perfect in the pristine snow, completely untouched. On the porch, two empty rocking chairs swayed gently back and forth in a wind that wasn't blowing. And carved freshly into the wooden door, as if it had always been there, were the words, "Henry and Martha. Still waiting. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey." If you enjoy stories that explore the darker corners of the imagination, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next tale. We'd love to have you in our community of story lovers. Until next time, stay curious. The morning sun bled pale over the forest, painting the cabin in a soft, golden light that managed to hide its rotting edges. It was a place that shouldn't exist, a forgotten corner of the world that only seemed to appear for certain people. Travelers would sometimes pass by, lost hikers, aimless wanderers, or those drawn by a map that was never meant to be found. Today, it was a young couple, Ethan and Lily, shivering from a cold that seemed to seep right into their bones. "It looks abandoned," Lily said, her voice a small puff of white in the frigid air as she brushed snow from the porch railing. The wood was cold and splintered beneath her glove. Ethan, however, felt a different kind of chill. He stared at the dark windows, which seemed to stare right back. "No," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the unnatural stillness of the place. "It looks... waiting." Against their better judgment, driven by the biting wind, they pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. As soon as their feet crossed the threshold, the door swung shut behind them with a deep, slow sigh, as if the cabin itself was breathing them in. The lock clicked into place with a sound of finality. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the grimy windows, floating like frozen breath in the still air. A strange smell hung heavy, a mixture of damp earth, old timber, and something else. It wasn't the comforting scent of a recent fire, but the acrid smell of something extinguished long ago. Then a faint melody began to hum from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a simple, haunting tune, the kind you feel you've heard before in a half-forgotten dream. It wrapped around them, a ghostly welcome. The atmosphere inside the cabin thickened with every passing second. Lily, trying to distract herself, ran a finger across a dusty wooden table in the center of the room. Her finger snagged on something. She leaned closer and saw two names carved into the surface: Henry and Martha. The strange thing was, despite the thick layer of dust everywhere else, the letters looked freshly cut, the wood inside the grooves still pale and raw. Meanwhile, Ethan was drawn to the stone fireplace. On the mantel sat a single, dust-covered photograph in a tarnished silver frame. He picked it up, wiping away the grime. It showed an older couple, a man and a woman, standing proudly in front of this very cabin. But something was wrong. The trees behind them in the photo looked different, younger, thinner. It was as if time itself had stepped back for the picture. "Ethan," Lily whispered, coming up behind him. She pointed a trembling finger at the photo. "Look at their eyes." He squinted. In the faded black and white image, the eyes of both the man and the woman held a faint, unnatural glow. They weren't reflecting light, they were emitting it, a soft, milky white luminescence that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, a loud tick echoed through the silent room. Both of them jumped. It came from an old grandfather clock in the corner. Its glass face was cracked straight down the middle, and its hands were missing entirely. Louder still, until it felt like the sound wasn't coming from the clock anymore, but from inside their own heads, a relentless, pounding rhythm. Panic began to set in. Ethan lunged for the door, rattling the handle, pulling with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. It was as solid as the stone fireplace. "It's stuck. I can't open it," he yelled, his voice tight with fear. Lily rushed to the window, peering out into the twilight. What she saw made her gasp. The forest was moving. It wasn't just the wind swaying the branches. The trees themselves were bending, their trunks contorting, their roots twitching and pulling themselves through the snow like gnarled fingers, crawling closer to the cabin. The woods were alive, and they were closing in. "We shouldn't be here," Lily whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "No one should," a voice replied from behind them. It was soft, female, and trembling with an impossible age. They spun around. For a fleeting second, standing in the shadowy hallway, they saw her. An old woman, Martha from the photograph, dressed in a simple, old-fashioned dress. She was smiling kindly, a gentle, welcoming smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to hold an infinite, lonely darkness. And then, she was gone. One moment, pale afternoon light was streaming through the windows. They'd turn around and suddenly it was the dead of night outside, with a full moon hanging in a black sky. They'd blink, and the morning sun would be pouring in again, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The world outside the cabin was in flux, a dizzying spiral of days and nights passing in mere seconds. A high-pitched whistle suddenly pierced the air. The kettle on the old cast-iron stove was boiling, steam puffing from its spout, but neither of them had lit the stove. The air in the room was still freezing cold. Driven by a morbid curiosity, Ethan reached out and touched the side of the kettle. He screamed and snatched his hand back. A red burn mark was already blistering on his skin. But the kettle had been ice cold to the touch. A burn from something frozen. It made no sense. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She was staring at the large, ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. Ethan followed her gaze, and his heart stopped. The mirror didn't reflect them as they were. It reflected an older version of them, their faces lined with weariness and sorrow, and their clothes. They were dressed in the same simple, dated clothing as the couple in the photograph. "Ethan, that's us," Lily sobbed. From deep within the walls, a faint knocking began. It was rhythmic, almost pleading. It seemed to be coming from every direction at once. It was slightly ajar, a strange warm glow seeping out from the crack below. With a shared look of dread, they knew they had to see what was down there. Ethan pulled the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. They descended the rickety wooden steps slowly, each one creaking like old bones snapping under their weight. The air grew warmer, yet the chill of fear only deepened. At the bottom of the stairs, the cellar was surprisingly bare. In the center of the small stone-walled room sat two simple wooden chairs, facing each other. They were empty, yet both were covered in a thin, glistening layer of frost. And between them, on a small, rickety table, sat two untouched cups of tea, steaming softly into the cold air. As they stared, a shadow moved between the chairs, a flicker of darkness in the lantern's glow. "We waited," a voice said. The single lantern hanging from the ceiling flickered violently. In that strobe of light and shadow, they saw them. Standing right behind their own real bodies were two other figures, their own silhouettes, older, frozen, their faces fixed in the same serene, smiling expressions as the figures in the mirror. Lily opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the silence of the cabin had swallowed her voice whole. Ethan reached for her hand, a desperate, final gesture. But as their fingers touched, they felt their skin turn cold, hard, and rough, like wood. Their bodies grew rigid, their feet rooting to the spot. The last thing they saw was the forest outside the cellar's tiny window, its branches shivering as if breathing in a deep, satisfying sigh. When the silence fell once more, all was still. And on the cabin's front door, just beneath the weathered carvings of Henry and Martha, two new names appeared, freshly etched into the wood. Ethan and Lily joined the wait. The cabin is always waiting. It's patient. It knows that sooner or later another lost traveler will see its welcoming light, another soul will seek shelter from the cold, and the wait will begin all over again. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey. If you enjoy tales of places that exist just outside the borders of our world, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the shadows. Settle in, because tonight we're journeying into a place where time stands still and the trees have secrets. The forest had gone quiet again, almost too quiet. A low mist drifted like a slow, silver breath, wrapping an old, forgotten hut in its embrace. Inside, the air was heavy, unmoving. Ethan sat alone at the wooden table. Lily was gone. Yet her teacup, sitting right there, still steamed, as if she had just taken a sip only a moment ago. The clock on the wall ticked with a soft, steady rhythm, but its hands never moved. He whispered her name, once, then twice. Each time, the sound echoed back, not from the room, but from the forest outside. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He stood, trembling, and stared out the window. The trees seemed closer than before, their familiar shapes twisted in the pale, ethereal light. He could almost see faces in their bark, faint and fleeting. One of them looked almost like Lily. With a heart pounding in his chest, Ethan opened the door slowly. The wind sighed through the pines, a mournful sound that carried the faint ghostly notes of moonlight serenade. Somewhere out there, in the deepening gloom, the song was playing again. He had to find her. He stepped into the fog, calling her name into the swirling whiteness. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, yielding, as if it remembered his every footstep, as if it knew where he was going. Then a figure appeared ahead, a splash of color in the monochrome world. It was Lily, in her red coat, a faint, sad smile on her face. "It's over," she said, her voice unnervingly calm, a gentle sound absorbed by the mist. He lunged forward, desperate to hold her, to make sure she was real. But when he reached for her, his hand passed through nothing but cold, empty air. "You stayed too long," she whispered, and her face began to blur, her form dissolving into the very mist she had emerged from. Ethan fell to his knees, his throat raw as he cried her name. But there was no answer. The mist only tightened around him, its cold touch feeling strangely like a possessive embrace. The trees swayed in a silent, hypnotic rhythm, their branches creaking a soft, mournful tune. Behind him, the cabin's door creaked open on its own. A warm, inviting light poured out, flickering like a welcoming firelight. And in that golden glow, he saw two figures sitting at the table he'd just left. It was Henry and Martha, the old caretakers. They smiled at him gently, their expressions full of an ancient understanding, as though they were welcoming an old friend home. The walls of the cabin shimmered, the old wood turning young again, the planks polished and new. It was the hut, but not as he knew it. It was the hut as it once was, perfect and untouched by time. "It never ends, does it?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking, a broken whisper. Martha smiled, her eyes glassy and kind, reflecting the candlelight. "It never began either," she whispered, and her words seemed to make the very air ripple. The clock on the wall, the one that had been frozen for so long, struck 11:59, one final, definitive time. The sound didn't just chime, it echoed like thunder, shaking the world to its core. And then the world bent. Ethan turned, and in the swirling mist, he saw every version of himself, young and hopeful, old and weary, broken and lost. He saw 1,000 lifetimes, all fading and merging into one another, a kaleidoscope of his own soul. Lily's voice whispered right beside his ear, soft and steady, a final, loving command. "Stay. Be still. The forest needs to remember." The cabin's candles, which had been flickering, flared into a brilliant white, then softened into a deep, warm gold. The ground trembled beneath him, and the fog rose higher and higher, a great silver tide that drowned the stars. Ethan's body stilled. His eyes, which had seen so much, finally dimmed. His breath slowed to a stop, but a small, peaceful smile remained on his lips, a look of ultimate acceptance. And then the forest went silent again. But in that silence, something new began. Slowly, two new trees grew beside the hut, tall and slender, side by side. As they reached for the sky, their bark intertwined halfway up, their branches locking together, forming a single, unified trunk. And on the wood, fresh carvings appeared, etched in neat, perfect letters. Ethan Puce Lily, forever here. The hut stood quietly, timeless as years folded in on themselves and vanished. New visitors would one day stumble upon it, their voices echoing with a sense of awe and wonder. They'd remark how strange it felt, how the forest seemed to hold its breath around them, how their watches would inexplicably freeze for a second, how the air smelled faintly of cedar and freshly brewed tea. They would never know the story. They would never know about Ethan and Lily. But every night, as the moon rose high and full, A faint, beautiful music would still drift from within the old hut's walls. And if you looked closely, you could see two shadows dancing slowly in the golden light. The clock would tick to 11:59, pause for a heartbeat, and then start its patient journey all over again. And the forest, their eternal guardian, would whisper gently, a soft and endless lullaby. Forever here. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It means the world to me. Until next time, stay curious and listen to the whispers in the woods.